But again, we thank you so much for joining. I don't know, forgive my memory if I gave Dr. Perrin a proper introduction. She's faculty in the Math and Statistics Department at Montgomery College in Maryland, and a research fellow at the AI-Collaboratory project that our dear colleague, Dr. Marciano, oversees. So without further ado, thank you so much for taking time and lending your brilliance and talent, Dr. Perrin, and please take it away.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that wonderful welcome, and thank you for your patience with me in getting connected this morning. And welcome everyone to our presentation today, and especially to this presentation on one of our projects related to computational treatments with the Legacy of Slavery collection at the Maryland State Archive. And so I'm going to take you through a particular case study that I was doing called Historic Black Lives Matter. And this is something that I did during the height of the Black Lives Movement in 2020, 2021. Where I wanted to be able to demonstrate how we could be using our archival collections to highlight the lives of enslaved and formerly enslaved folks in Maryland in particular. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through our motivation for doing this project, what the context and the background was, talk about the data itself, and then talk about the design in this project. This is a project that's based is an outcome of several layers of activity, some of which you'll hear about today, using the same sets of data. So I'll be referencing some things that some of my colleagues will be going into more detail with later as well. And so, there's a big question about, why think about visualizing archival records, and, especially historic records in particular tend to be more of a written or physical nature. How is it that we might be able to visualize those records, and why would we do that? And here you see, three key reasons, at least, that were driving my explorations. The first is that we have this vast repository, all of these vast repositories of information that are not really tapped into, that allow us to potentially view our historical record through a different lens, from a different perspective, from a different set of knowledge. Here's an opportunity to do that, to actually approach those records from a different visual and physical perspective, but also from the perspective of having the knowledge in the context of today as opposed to yesterday. There's an opportunity. The second reason is the opportunity for us to have better representation of the people and events that are in those records, in particular, records that deal with African American and Black experience in the United States. When folks are represented in those records, if at all, it is not necessarily from the perspective or from the perspective or from the experience of those communities and those persons who tend to be marginalized or erased from records in general. And then the third part is just really practical in terms of being able to aid our discovery and enhance our access to the information and the knowledge that's contained in these records. So this Historic Black Lives Matters is an extension of some projects that we've been doing that we began in about 2019 and are ongoing in various forums, where we're looking at computational treatments for the Legacy of Slavery collection at the Maryland State Archives. So when you see that CTLOS, that's what we're talking about, computational treatments for legacy of slavery. And so this particular project is an extension of what was an original interdisciplinary research project and exploration that we did back in 2019 and uh, was subsequently presented at IEEE's Big Data Conference in 2020 in the Computational Archival Science workshop there. And so our goal in CTLOS was to really look at how can we use computational methods broadly to look at archival records, enhance those histories, gain some experience in using computational thinking and computational methods to open up those records to new analysis and to new knowledge. And so we were using interdisciplinary teams for that and creating some learning and teaching artifacts. Out of that effort came several, you see, it's not just several, quite a list of potential research areas for us to explore subsequently. And one of those areas was looking at interactive visualization of our data sets that we were working on. So that's what I'm going to talk today is about that particular project where I've looked at creating an interactive dashboard with the data from our particular connection, our particular collection. So you see that this is an extension of the CTLOS research. The goal was to create those visualizations in a way that were accessible on the web and allowed anyone, the casual user, to explore these offerings that are on the Maryland State Archives website. Maryland State Archives has some really incredible resources that teachers and historians and students can access now, but we wanted to have a new way to interface with that knowledge. The other aspect of this was that I was really looking at, could we use design principles that undergird principles of data visualization with this type of data? Is it possible to take this type of data and actually present it in a way that allows access to information, but also allows the discovery of new knowledge as well? So you see here some of the design methods that went into creating this project. As we continue on, perhaps during the question and answers period, if there's interest in some of those details, I'd be happy to go through it at that time. So the data which I've been talking about, the data that we use comes from a set of freedom records, several sets of freedom records that are available in the Maryland State Archives. Two sets of records in particular were ones that we have worked with consistently throughout our computational treatments activities. One is a collection of certificates of freedom, and the other a collection of manumissions documents. And all of those documents are accessible in individual form. If you search for a person or if you search for a place, you might be able to pull up digitized information or indices about those things through the Legacy of Slavery website. We were interested in taking that information that had been datafied and seeing what we could learn from it using computational techniques. Just as background, manumission documents were any type of document that freed an enslaved person. And in the state of Maryland, those documents took various forms. They were in land and probate records, chattel records, they were in wills, they were in codices to contracts, and so on and so forth. So those documents are varied in terms of format and form, and yet have some specific information that was digitized by volunteers and put into a database by the Maryland State Archives. The certificates of freedom, which to my knowledge are fairly unique to the state of Maryland, were similar to the types of passes that were created in South Africa during the apartheid era. And these were documents, because there were so many freed African Americans in addition to enslaved in the state of Maryland. Folks had to have a way to prove that they had in fact been manumitted. And so they carried these certificates of freedom, which were very detailed documents that described them and indicated their current or former status in them as well. So these two documents formed the basis, two types of documents formed the basis of our analysis. This just gives you an idea of the data flow, the flow from original documents, some of which are manuscripts, some are typewritten newspaper types of documents, or typeset, I should say, for that era. But it gives you a sense of that, the data is coming from these documents. It's scanned in some way, transcribed, datafied, and then we took some of that digitized, datafied information and began really using this process of cleaning it and getting it into a form where we could analyze it with various computational methods. And just to give you a sense of the documents that we were using, notice that we've got over 7,000 records for the manumissions, 23,600 and so records for the certificates of freedom, all of which had various anomalies, which is part of another talk, and we can talk about that later. But what I do want to focus on is the manumissions documents, which, quite a large number of documents covering only part of the territory in the state of Maryland, documents coming from only 10 counties, various anomalies. And this gives you a sense of just some of the basic descriptive analytics of the human beings that that are codified in those documents, from infants to 80-year-olds. It's fairly well split between male and female as well. So we were able to, in our initial analysis, we were able to, and I want to focus on manumissions for this part of our discussion. We ran some typical analyses, static analyses on the data. Where the records were from geographically, how that looked in terms of, how many records were, how they were dispersed throughout the counties where we had information. We visualized in a static way, where the manumissions documents were by year and by county. That gave us a picture. But it didn't allow us to explore. And so, as I said, part of our intention coming out of this was to look at were there ways that we could create interactive visualizations with this data. And so that's where the historical Black Lives Matters really took over the ball in terms of looking at what kind of design could we have to create an interactive visualization of this data to allow discovery. The first challenge that we had is that, as you saw before, most of these documents are text, and a lot of visualizations, whether they're static or interactive, depend on numbers. So part of the challenge was trying to find ways to take that information and to put it into quantifiable elements that could then be displayed on a dashboard. as I mentioned before, a lot of the information was non-standard in its format. Even just pulling out information about, who's male, who's female, we weren't able to just go to one spot in a document to get that information, or it was inferred, or it may have not been transcribed correctly at certain times. So that was a challenge. Um, a big a big objective for me was making sure that we were remembering and that it was clear in our visualization that this data, this collection represents human beings. This represents lives lived. And so in our presentation, there is a respect for the human beings, the human lives that underlie the data, that underlie then the presentation of the data. How to create in a way that engages and communicates was one of the challenges. And then, as always, when you think about designing these dashboards, you think about all the wonderful, fabulous things you might possibly do, the idealized design versus what actually is technically possible, especially given the data that we have, but also given part of our objective here is to teach and to learn and to allow others to use the same or similar techniques. So what could we do using primarily openly available software and techniques that did not require people to be master coders? So what I ended up doing, and we'll all get a chance to look at this in a moment. I created this dashboard on Tableau, and here you see a static version of the dashboard, and that dashboard allows us to look at the age and sex of various, that are represented in the manumissions documents by county and by year. This is a large overview. It allowed us to look at the trends in terms of the manumissions, the number of manumissions documents that were recorded by county and overall in years. It allowed us to look at, go into detail on the county basis to see what were some of the trends on a county basis. And then there was a static overview of that as well. So I'm going to, hold on just a moment. I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. What I'm going to do is I'm going to drop into the chat the link to this board. Where's our chat? Here it is here. Okay, and so I'm going to invite you to join me on the dashboard itself, and we'll take a look at these elements. Hopefully, yes, it is actually rendering nicely. So I'm going to go back. Bear with me for just a moment. I'm operating off of 3 screens here. All right. So I'm going to take us to that dashboard now. Okay. So this is the dashboard as it exists. And you're welcome to begin playing around with it. I'm going to actually talk to I'm going to manipulate a few things on the dashboard here. I do have slides that say basically the same thing that I'm saying, and so we'll make sure you have those. But basically, as I said, our first design element was this one up in the upper left, representing the people. And so the types of questions that one can explore here are how old were people when they were granted their freedom? Were they male or female? Are there differences among the counties in terms of who was granted freedom and at what age? And so we're able to take these selectors. We can take out information. We can highlight one particular county. And you'll also see that the the element below is changing as well because they are linked to each other. We can look at by county, we can adjust the years that we're looking at information for with this slider. And you'll notice that this changes the information that's available to us so that these elements allow us to pinpoint information by time and by place about the people who were involved. Part of the design element used here, of course, was in terms of color, using these slider features to give us a non-static view of elements. And you'll see as well that in addition to color, just the positioning of the elements allows us to draw our attention to particular items as well. One of the things that we remember, part of the reason for doing this is to recover knowledge, as we said. And so one of the things that we discovered during this, I'm actually going to, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to put this back over for just a moment. So one of the things that we discovered doing this is that, you know, we were able to look at the interactive features there to look at patterns and how that distribution of ages changed and varied over time. We saw that by county, and it allowed us to begin to ask questions about really what were some of the practices or historical events, what was going on culturally, historically, economically during those times when we see those patterns at play. So this was a very nice beginning of asking new questions for us. Our second design element, hopefully you're in the dashboard. I'll go back to that in just a moment. Time and place, as you notice, is connected to the people as well. Interactive so that we're able to change, we're able to select years, we're able to select counties as well. We're looking at the number of manumissions by year, and that timeline, we're able to choose whether we want to spotlight view or not for certain elements. And there's something called a tooltip view in Tableau. As you see, if I'm touching something with my mouse, I'm actually able to see the particular data information. The same here with our age as well, right? So I'm able to get the specifics of that information as a user, as a viewer, as I'm looking at this. And as I mentioned before, these two, well, actually all of them are tied in with these sliders and these selectors so that we're able to spotlight if we're really, for instance, interested in what was happening right at the beginning of the 19th century, maybe from 1801 through 1819 or so, we get a view of the dynamics that are happening at that time. So that's the spotlight ability. One of the learning questions are the example of recovered knowledge. As you see here, we could see distinct trends in the manumissions themselves, including some very peculiar peaks that happened well in advance of the Civil War. Maryland's Emancipation Proclamation for the state of Maryland. Actually, the anniversary is tomorrow. It's November 2nd in 1864. But those patterns led us to look at what were some of the movements that facilitated or hindered freedom of enslaved populations. And in particular, we did find some interesting tracking along with movements to send, to manumit people and to send them back to Africa. There was a real strong movement in the late 1820s through early 1830s, and that shows up in our data as well. The third element sorry, let me just bring this back. Our third element up in the upper right-hand corner is a geographic focus, and this one actually is an automated element. Um, uh, I'll click on it in a moment to show you. It'll kind of run through a timeline for you. And this is really just looking at the collection of documents through the years. So if I click that button, what it does is it's just taking me on a timeline through every year where we've got documentation where we can see by county the numbers of folks being manumitted. And one of the things that we noticed earlier on is that at certain times, in certain counties, things would peak and then, we've got an ebb and flow through the counties as well. So you've got that view that's available to you. So uncovered knowledge there, this just gives us a little bit more granular view of the manumissions documents during the period under review. And as I mentioned, it kind of complements some of the things we're seeing in the trends in terms of, why are we seeing more, periods where we have more or less folks being manumitted, especially when they're concentrated around particular times and not anywhere near times that we might normally think historically we would see that kind of movement. And then finally, anchoring the dashboard in the right-hand corner is the only static element of the dashboard, and that is our just the big picture. All of the counties, all of the years, in a using color to differentiate the different counties, but just gives us sort of that overall picture of what's happening with manumissions in the state and gives you context for what's going on in some of the other dynamic elements. And so, we see that robust pattern of manumissions during the first decades of the 19th century, a sharp drop in the 1830s. There are some historical reasons why that dropped. Things kind of stayed at that level until actual emancipation in 1864. And you see that 1864, of course, was when the state of Maryland actually did its emancipation. In the 1860s, 1861, 62, you see a slight, in some counties, there's a slight uptick, and that's because, especially in the agricultural counties, such as Queen Anne's County and Kent County, which are on the eastern shore of Maryland, a lot of enslaved folks were manumitted to go and serve in the U.S. colored troops. And there's a whole background behind that as well. So I'm going to encourage you, I'm going to go back to the slides, encourage you to continue playing with the sliders and the selectors so that you have a sense of that as well. Our conclusions are the conclusions that I drew. So one of the things is that I did some initial user testing with this, just to understand how different elements played or how they communicated. And so what we found, which is we all know because we love clicking on these dashboard types of things, is that the dynamic and interactive elements are really important to engaging our interest, but also to telling a story and to helping us explore and engage in a way where we begin asking questions, but we also may find answers to questions as well. The position of the elements were very important. I tried several, putting those key four design elements in various positions. We found that having the people at that primary position at the top and having the anchor of the static at the bottom really resonated and appealed to people. It was not something that I'm not a designer necessarily. And so, these are things I would not have thought about, but we're basically supported by our feedback. Having that variety of elements, some of the same information is in each of the presentations, but you're able to get at it from a different context or a different level of granularity. So having that information presented with here, it's different marks. So marks is something that you talk about in data visualizations in terms of how you present position, color, how you present your axes, where the level of interactivity and things like that. So that really having that difference once again created greater engagement. The color palette that was chosen turned out to be very, very important. I was fortunate that I had someone on one of my feedback panels who was colorblind, and who, I had chosen what I thought was a very visually appealing color palette, and they simply could not see the distinctions because of that. And so what's very nice is that Tableau and other data visualization types of software or platform have very specific color palettes that are user-friendly and accessible for folks who are colorblind. And then fewer elements plus higher interactivity creates that interest in usability. So there are 4 elements on here. You're not going from page to page to get to things. You're able to, with Tableau, you're actually able to blow up or blow out one of the 4 elements if you want to look at it more closely. But having just those 4 rather than, a big set of all kinds of different elements, I found when I tested this, did create more interest in interactivity. So that's, I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to go back and highlight things that you find of interest, answer questions about both the data, some of the choices in the visualization, some of the mechanics behind the visualization, or anything else that might be coming up for you at this time. So thank you again.
You can hear us clapping, Dr. Perine. Thank you so much. That is fascinating. And let me move spotlight so we can all see you and being community.
Yeah.
Well, I want to give others an opportunity to ask. I have a question, but I want to give others an opportunity to ask questions first, if they have any.
I'll say,
Can you hear me from there?
Oops, it looks like you're muted again.
okay,
Yeah.
well, I
Yeah.
was worried about the feedback in the room, but no worries. I'll say that I've been following this project for a very long time, probably maybe since the inception, and I am just floored, deeply impressed. And I remember when I was starting my archival career, and there was this project with the State Archives Legacy of Slavery, and I just was fascinated. So I just want to give kudos to you and everyone involved in this project, that it is just amazing how we can make access happen to such legacies on a wider scale that most people have no idea about, but projects like this make that knowledge accessible and makes us more aware as a society. So kudos to you, Richard, everyone who's done such amazing work on this project.
Thank you so very much. It's been very much I'm impressed by my colleagues and what they're able to do, but I'm really appreciative that as a team we're able to um, really highlight both the collections and also what we can do with the technology to enable that access and that recovery of knowledge.
Dr. Perrin, I was wondering about have you seen some of the implications of your work, like used in research or I'd be interested to know, now that you've done this incredible work, how have you seen people using that data, or, yeah, if that makes sense.
Well, so thank you. Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen are sort of direct and indirect use of the work. Certainly within our team, beyond me and others within our team, there are various things that we're doing um, that that key off of some of the new technical capabilities. So I'm not going to steal his thunder, but one of my colleagues is going to talk about that a little bit later. So I'm just teeing you up for coming attractions. But I do think we also see in other places, I'm thinking about some of the efforts at the University of Michigan, for instance, where they've looked at not this particular collection, but they've looked at other collections of information on the transatlantic trade, slave trade. They've taken slightly different approaches, but what we're seeing are obviously are complementary types of activity. I have not yet seen, or excuse me, what I do see is that we've built a very nice learning community through the AIC, and I believe Richard has probably introduced that as well. But these types of things like the dashboard or the notebooks or these various these artifacts that we create that are then available to be used in a classroom setting or by an individual scholar, I think are sort of our primary dissemination method, in addition to any papers that we may write, of course, because we're academics. So.
No, awesome. Thank you. And we have a wonderful student. Gianna has a question. Gianna, you want to, I'm sorry to trouble you. You want to come around? So,
when you mentioned the importance of acknowledging that this is data on real people and real lives, how you apply the guidelines in an archival context to a computational context, and what is your framework to ensure the consideration of humanness when dealing with data and identification?
Yeah, so I think part of what we are doing is developing those guidelines. And presenting presenting prototypes for how one approaches both the archival collections and the computational methods with from a socio-technical perspective. And so, I'm the person who always talks about the socio-technical, but the understanding that, and this is true whenever we're dealing with any computational treatments of anything, is that data represents people. And so how we work with data, how we represent data, we want to have that in mind. There are not any particular standards or guidelines that are existing. I think what we do is we model how that understanding and sensitivity comes into play in terms of what we select to represent and how we represent those things. In a collection such as this, you don't necessarily have personally identifiable information, right? But you still have information about communities of people. And so there's not that level of sensitivity. Similar work that members of our team have done with, say, for example, the records of Japanese internment in the, during World War II. Those data sets will have personally identifying information, right? And so one has to be really careful about, first of all, not following, there's common guidelines and practice for PII types of things that we have in any record keeping situation. Applying those to that type of analysis is important as well. And figuring out how to, I'm thinking of some other colleagues that we are beginning to work with who are looking at data related to the boarding schools, the Indian boarding schools that to which many Native American children were sent, and where many of them died, unfortunately. So there's a lot of documentation around lives of people, some of whom are still living, relatives of whom are still living. And even if they weren't, that data is about people, how one of the discussions is how to use computational methods to get information that will enrich the understanding of the community, and perhaps be able to communicate stories better outside of the community, or communicate knowledge outside of the community without breaching the privacy and trust of the community as well as the individuals. So those are things that we're figuring out, and yet know that it's not impossible to already be doing that. And I think this type of project does show it's actually possible to highlight the humanity even with limited information, right? What we know about these. I mean, we've got there are names of people and things like that, but can you sort of just bring to life information about human lives in an anonymous way, but something that tells a story? I think that's a key part of what we're doing.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you so much, Dr. Perine. That's a great point, an excellent point. And Gianna, thank you for that wonderful question. Because I think it's just so important to, again, consider the ways that, I don't know, I feel like sometimes the stereotype is when we think about technology. I feel like Richard and I were talking about this the other day, technology and archives. It seems very it can seem very transactional and about, okay, this is your great advancement, technology, but that the fact that they're human lives, and even as you said, we're looking at the enslaved ancestors, these are still human beings, and how can we hold the humanity and dignity and respect privacy, but not encourage secrecy, but at the same time to use that. So again, Gianna, thank you for that excellent question, and Dr. Perine, thank you for that incredible, thoughtful answer. We have a few more minutes. We're fortunate enough to have Dr. Perine for to 10:15. Does anybody, Professor Washington, do any of your students have any questions?
Well, we just switched out classes, so you got a new wave of students. I think we missed everybody, but so far so good. Wave hello,
Okay.
10 o'clock class.
Hey, everybody.